will find the time to hang with us and watch it. It is in the public domain. There's a somewhat sad story about that. George Romero forgot to copyright it, so it's out there, and it has always been out there. He hasn't made a single cent off of this film, but it did, of course, kind of kickstart his career and allowed him to have a very successful film career. This is kind of cool that we're doing this through Zoom. What it affords us is a chat window. And Christopher already talked about how he might, he'll put some things in the chat. I would encourage anybody at any point, if you have questions for me or points of clarification or something you want to know, you can put it in the chat in real time, and then it can be a little bit more of an interactive lecture than just me talking a lot, which I am comfortable with, but maybe it'd be more interesting if you all had something to say. Where does this film come from? 1968. 1968, Night of the Living Dead comes out. 1968 is a super important year in film history because it's the year the long-standing production code fell apart and went inactive. And so filmmakers in 68 were a little edgier and able to explore adult film content a little bit more freely. It didn't super affect this film because it was released unrated. And because of the lack of copyright, it was quickly used as midnight movies and B-reels, and even made its way to television very quickly. But the point was that 68 produced a lot of somewhat shocking material. In addition to Night of the Living Dead, that's the year that Rosemary's Baby came out. And a lot of the film production that year led to the rating system coming online in 69 because of fear of exposing people to shocking material. This film at the time was very shocking. You may find it a little tame by today's standards, but 68 was a different time, and Romero was really pushing for a scary, scary story. So a couple of things about that. He was a film student, so if you can believe it, this is a student film. It was made for almost nothing, using locations around Pittsburgh, where Romero was, where he was going to school, with unpaid extras. He just asked people, hey, you want to come be in a monster movie, a horror movie, you want to join me? And a lot of people did. And so he just kind of put it together with what he had available, equipment they had available. The actors provided their own costumes, which were basically just their clothes. They did do some pretty good makeup effects and some other things like that. Part of that required visiting the local butcher shop and getting buckets of offal, of like cow's blood and pig intestine and stuff like that to use on the location. And Romero asked the extras to do kind of gross things with them. And they did. They were totally willing to kind of gnaw on this raw meat for the shoot. And so the film has a little bit of a rough quality. I think the rough quality really adds to the film. It's not a found footage film, and it's not presented in as kind of a realistic filming the way you might get from, you know, the Blair Witch Project. It is intended to be a film, but it's got that kind of unpolished, unrehearsed, independent film quality that works particularly well with the black and white, and a relatively effective score. Up until this point, though, the zombie that we know today wasn't the zombie that people knew then. Zombie movies prior to 1968 were largely films about voodoo, about Africa and the Caribbean, and they were misrepresentations of voodoo culture, or more properly, voodoo culture, the religion of the Caribbean and of Africa, where the legend of the zombie was a person whose spirit had been trapped, and so their body was stuck on the earth without a spirit. My research has led me to believe that those early beliefs in African zombies kind of merged with Catholicism, particularly in Haiti, and the worship of saints and the idea of resurrection, and kind of developed this new idea of the zombie being a creature brought back from the dead. Of course, some of that was actual fact, because in Haiti, and Wade Davis figured this out when he went adventuring around in the 80s, in Haiti, they developed a type of anesthetic called tetrodotoxin. Tetrodotoxin is made from a pufferfish poison and other local herbs and I think a frog poison. And what it does is it renders the victim comatose, and it slows down their metabolism to the point that without proper medical examination, someone would appear to be dead. Well, in Haiti, because of the climate, dead people were buried quite rapidly. And so anyone poisoned by tetrodotoxin would have been buried and then could have been exhumed uh, at dawn, living, but having suffered brain damage both from the poison and from the lack of oxygen. And then these semi-comatose, lobotomized people would be sold into slavery. So the idea of the zombie has two origins, this kind of African folklore and also this, this kind of horrifying folk practice. And the films that resulted from those legends follow suit. White Zombie, I Walked with a Zombie, King of the Zombies, there's quite a few in the 30s and 40s. Romero didn't want to make a zombie movie. In fact, you'll notice that Night of the Living Dead never says the word zombie once. Zombie wasn't a super mainstream word at the time. Instead, he wanted to make a low-budget adaptation of Richard Matheson's vampire novel, I Am Legend. And I've gotten into many arguments about whether I Am Legend is about vampires or zombies, and I am definitively telling you all this evening it is about vampires. They're photosensitive, they drink blood, sounds like a vampire to me. But Romero liked that idea, and he liked the idea of the ghoul. Well, the ghoul is cool because the ghoul comes from the Middle East. The ghoul is an Arabian creature, which is actually a demon, usually a female demon, that inhabits graveyards and eats the flesh of dead humans. So you can kind of see Romero's very creative process. Okay, so we've got this legend of the zombie. We've got this legend of the flesh-eating ghoul. We've got the vampire, which is the creature that comes back from the dead and feasts upon the living. We have the communicability of the vampire, that if you're bitten by a vampire, you become a vampire. And he kind of fused all these things together to create what we now would call the zombie, and in fact would be the most common form of the zombie today. The Walking Dead, which is probably the most popular zombie narrative ever created, is based on this idea from Romero. So inadvertently, because he wasn't setting out to do this, he was just trying to make a horror movie, inadvertently, Romero created the rules. He created the rules of the zombie, which is they are back from the dead, they are animated corpses, they have no conscious mind, they don't have much of a memory of their former life, although there can be vestiges. They generally, at least for 20 years or so, couldn't talk. Talking zombies is a more recent phenomenon. They relentlessly hunted the living and they ate the living. Now, unlike vampires, they didn't just drink blood, they ate the body. And although it has become a little more popular to say that zombies eat brains, Romero's zombies eat everything. Being bitten by a zombie turns you into one because you get infected and it kills you. But of course, if the zombies eat your body, there's nothing to come back. So that's kind of the preferred result of a zombie attack, is you get eaten. Otherwise, you come back from the dead and now you get to go try to kill your friends and loved ones. Zombies can generally be killed by destroying the brain, even though that seems contradictory because they don't seem to have much of a brain capacity. But the idea is that the higher brain functions don't work, but the kind of reptilian brainstem does. So decapitation is a great way to get rid of a zombie. Burning a zombie is great because then there's really nothing left to be ambulatory. But any kind of traumatic head injury generally will take a zombie down, at least according to Romero. So he had a creature. He had a version of the vampires from I Am Legend, because that's a book everyone should read. And spoiler, there are two types of vampires. A vampire that is more sophisticated and then a vampire that is more zombie-like. Romero liked the vampire that was more zombie-like. And he loved the idea of the story, which is somebody being held up in a house while hordes of these ambulatory dead bodies are trying to break in. Well, that has a long tradition too. It's, some of us call it the siege narrative. Siege narratives I like a lot. And you can probably think of a lot of versions of this, but the siege narrative became kind of the standard zombie narrative. Prior to that, you did see zombies in horror comics, like the EC comic series and Tales from the Crypt. And zombies usually were more mummy-like. That is, they came back from the dead for vengeance or to fulfill a curse. So you get a lot of these comics in the 50s in particular, where like a cheating wife has an affair and that guy kills her husband, but then he comes back from the dead and kills them. And so you do get this kind of vengeful mummy-like zombie. Romero didn't make it that personal. Romero made the zombie mindless, and he made the zombie numerous. Most of the EC comics, it's a single zombie. And most of the early zombie films, they are slaves to a voodoo master or an alien, as in the very exciting Plan 9 from Outer Space. So Romero said, I'm going to change this, and I'm going to make it a siege narrative. Now, his primary inspiration for the siege narrative was The Birds. Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds had come out in '63, so it was relatively new, relatively fresh in everyone's mind. It was based on a Daphne du Maurier short story. And the principle of that narrative is a family is stuck inside a house while they're being assaulted for no discernible reason by homicidal birds that are on the outside. And if you've seen The Birds, you're going to see a lot of imagery in Night of the Living Dead that is very similar. Boarding up of the windows, running outside to get supplies and coming back in, breaking windows, creatures breaking their way and finding their way in, people who initially love and care for each other breaking down under the stress and coming against each other. And then ultimately this sense of we've got to escape, we've got to get out of here. So those fundamental elements of the siege narrative come largely from The Birds, and they became the staple for Romero. Night of the Living Dead takes place in a farmhouse. Dawn of the Dead takes place in a shopping mall. Day of the Dead takes place in an underground military bunker. Land of the Dead takes place in an apartment high-rise. Diary of the Dead takes place in a mobile home, really, like an RV, and then it becomes a house. That one's underrated, but I think it's actually quite interesting. And then you get something like Shaun of the Dead that takes place in a bar. The Walking Dead for a period takes place in a prison. So it's a very common trope in these narratives, the idea of being trapped and being besieged by monsters from the outside. That was another big thing he took from I Am Legend. Lots of monsters, a plague of monsters, if not an apocalypse of monsters, because I Am Legend, there's one human being left on the planet as far as the reader and the protagonist knows. Zombie films are ambiguous. Sometimes you think maybe this is it, maybe there's safe people elsewhere, and it plays upon our fears of isolation and being cut off. Another inspiration for Night of the Living Dead is Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Don Siegel film, the idea that the threat looks like your friends and family, that you don't know who you can trust, you don't know who is safe. That obviously is a manifestation of the Red Scare, fear of communism, not knowing who will betray you. And so what makes Night of the Living Dead scary, and other zombie films like it, is the monsters are the protagonists, or the one-time protagonists. Because as a zombie film progresses, the human heroes decrease in number and the zombie monsters increase in number. Well, it's really hard to fight a monster that keeps replenishing its number, especially when it's replenished by your allies. So what he's doing then with all this kind of foundational premise of the film is he's tying into a number of different sources, or as I like to call them, antecedents. If we think of the film as like a pronoun, the antecedents are the things that are being referenced. So Night of the Living Dead, while it seems to be an original film that invents a new kind of zombie, it's really drawing from existing zombie films, from The Birds, from I Am Legend, from Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Plague of the Zombies is a really great British zombie film that kind of crosses the line over into a little bit more Romero country. And he brings all that together, and he does it in a very low budget traditional B-movie style. So you'll notice some tropes. There's thunder, there's lightning, there's a woman running and tripping, being chased by a man who is methodical in his pursuit. There's arguing, there's gunfire, there's Molotov cocktails. Maybe that one's not as common. But you do get all of these elements that you recognize from other films. I think Romero's to be admired here because he, rather than just invent something new, he invented something new through the synthesis of things that exist. And what I call that is assemblage. Assemblage, which actually comes from winemaking, but the idea of taking different flavors and different wines and blending them together to create something new and something with a different taste, but from which you can recognize the original material. That's what's going on. Okay, that's a lot. So I know I talked a lot about that, but I think it's important when we approach a text to have a general sense of where the text comes from and what the author and the filmmaker of the texts are trying to kind of convey. Here's some things to watch for. Night of the Living Dead came out in the 60s, and it's playing with the idea that the idyllic nuclear family of the 50s is no more. That the 60s is all about counterculture. It's about a war in Vietnam that many protest against. It's about drug culture. It's about the breakdown of some of what had been foundational institutions in the United States. So I think it's significant that the film largely takes place in a home, in a house, in a farm home, but it's significant that the owners of that home are dead, and they're dead from the beginning of the film. So instead, we have a dysfunctional group of people playing house, and they don't get along. We do have a family. We have a couple of family units. We have a brother and a sister who are at odds with each other. We have a kind of abusive husband and a sick child. And we see that those family structures are not sufficient to keep everybody safe. And one thing that he does that was quite revolutionary is he has a Black protagonist. This is a point of some discussion, if not contention. I want to get his name right. Dwayne Jones plays Ben. Ben is the hero, he's the main character, and he's Black. He's a Black man in a cast full of white people, particularly white women. This was a little bit unusual even in 1968, and Romero says it was not intentional. He went to his grave saying, I simply cast the person who did the best audition, and Dwayne did the best audition. Well, that could be true, and I'm not saying it's not true, but the fact is, Night of the Living Dead ended up being a movie with a Black protagonist in an era where Black protagonists in otherwise largely white suburban middle-class films was very unusual. So the film does, whether intentionally or not intentionally, have a lot to say about race relations. Ben, in his attempts to stay safe and to keep others safe, resorts to violence and is violent towards both a white woman and a white male authority figure, whom you would maybe expect in '68 to be the actual protagonist. This complicates the ending of the film, which I'm not going to give away because some of you haven't seen it and are going to want to watch it. The ending of the film is so overtly political in terms of race relations and social injustice that I cannot accept the fact that Romero did it on accident. It's very powerful and it's very poignant in terms of a critique of the United States history concerning race and race relations. So that's another key element to pay attention to. Made all the more poignant, I think, because of the black and white, even though it was basically filmed in black and white because of budgetary reasons. The other thing for you to watch for is this film, much like Today, plays on the idea that the media cannot be trusted. So throughout the film, media experts or so-called experts keep giving the heroes mixed, conflicted, and downright incorrect information. And so the film is really taking a shot at the news media because people had kind of begun to lose their faith in the media because of how Vietnam was being handled and how the war was being presented. Speaking of Vietnam, because for the first time, people in the United States were being confronted with relatively unfiltered, horrifying images of war, the violence in this film is a little bit more realistic than you would see in films prior to 1965 or so, because people were more aware what trauma to the human body actually looked like and what violence could mean. It becomes more severe in the follow-up film, Dawn of the Dead, because Romero's lead makeup artist from that film forward is a man named Tom Savini, who was a photographer in Vietnam and who spent years becoming very familiar with wounds and dismemberment. And so he brought that familiarity to his makeup work. As a result, Night of the Living Dead is not terribly graphic. It's not particularly gory or violent, whereas Dawn of the Dead is. I think Dawn of the Dead is a superior film, but not because it's gorier. I think it's more sophisticated because Romero had 10 years to reinvent his whole thing. So media is something to watch for. Echoes of Vietnam and social unrest are also things to watch for. Those are kind of the main highlights. This idea of the house being a place of refuge that falls apart, the family that cannot stay together, the relentlessness of death, the unstoppable nature of death. And that's where we come to everyone's favorite subject, Sigmund Freud. Yay. Oh, look at all the thumbs up. Oh, nope, none of them. Sigmund Freud talks about the return of the repressed, which is we don't like to think about things, so we stop thinking about them, and then they come and bug us anyway. We can't keep them hidden forever. The biggest thing we repress is death, mortality, fear of pain and injury and loss, fear of loss of life. Horror films are all about the return of the repressed and forcing us to confront our deepest, darkest fears. Well, Freud writes that the best way to help someone confront their fears, and he's talking about psychoanalysis and therapy, is to confront people with uncanny images. Uncanny images being images that are both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time, jarring juxtapositions that force us to reconsider not only what we're being confronted with, but what we're repressing. Well, Freud writes in his landmark essay, The Uncanny, that one of the most uncanny symbols possible is the animated corpse. Corpses are familiar, but they're disturbing, and they're supposed to be still. So once you animate a corpse, it forces you to come to terms with the fact that death is a reality, and it's an inescapable reality that you too will have to face at some point. So the Greeks would say a film such as Night of the Living Dead is therapeutic, cathartic, because it allows us a safe space in which to explore our fears and traumas associated with our repressed anxiety concerning death and mortality. And Romero does that by slowly and gradually assaulting us with more and more corpses, more and more horrific accidents, more and more death and dismemberment, bleak, hopeless, and ultimately inevitable. So I think it's a pretty great film. It is the hallmark zombie film. It's the zombie film that gave birth to all following zombie films. It changed the trajectory of the zombie film forever and essentially created a new monster from an old one, a fusion of old ones. And they are still pretty dang popular today. If anything, they're more popular now than they ever were when Romero was working in the 60s and 70s. And so I hope you enjoy the film tonight, and I hope you enjoy the other festivities that Christopher's put together for us this evening. Thanks.
Awesome, thank you so much. I actually, did anybody have any questions that you didn't get a chance to put in chat for Dr. Bishop?
I'm very open to questions if anybody has any.
Because I was kind of curious, because it was mentioned, there was some discussion when he mentioned I Am Legend, and the connection with vampires. Do you let's see. Do you, because I know that there was some kind of anxiety that Bram Stoker was working from, right, in terms of like xenophobia and like all of these things. How much do you think that kind of played into like Romero's conception of the zombie? Or
I don't, because the scary thing about Dracula is miscegenation. Dracula is really scary because he's getting jiggy with white women. Ultimately, that's the reason they have to destroy him, is because he's an Easterner who may be Muslim, may be Jewish, may be something, but he's not white and he's not British. So Dracula is awesome. It's one of my favorite books, but it's really about imperialism and the fear of the colonies rising up against the empire, and about the tainting of pure bloods. You don't really get that from Romero. His is really more this sense of being overwhelmed by an unstoppable force, the horde. You really only get the horde in zombie films and in I Am Legend. And but the fact that, and it's fun when you think about it in terms of adaptation. I Am Legend became Night of the Living Dead, more or less. So recent adaptations of I Am Legend have drawn from zombie films. So the original Vincent Price film, Last Man on Earth, is pretty close to the novel. And it has the last man and the siege narrative and the two types of vampires. And it's a pretty great B film with Vincent Price. And I see Sarah's drawn our attention to that film. It's really great. There's a weird version with Chuck Heston, the Omega Man, which is mutants, kind of mutant people from a comet or solar radiation. It's a good film, but it's weird. And then you get the Will Smith version, where it's gone back to the novel, but it can't escape the powerful influence of Romero. And while they are vampires, they're definitely taking advantage of the popularity of the zombie at the time. My problem with the Will Smith film is it's a little bit too much action film, and they 180-degree flip the ending. And I don't have to have my adaptations be 100% true to the source, but I don't like that level of change. But still vampires, still photosensitive, and except for Minecraft, zombies are not photosensitive. I don't know why they are in Minecraft, but so be it. So are skeletons. I don't know.
awesome. Thank you. And I will put in a plug for the Omega Man. That was the first version, the film version that I saw. And you're right, it is very weird and very, very 70s. Is the only way I know how to put it. I did. We're going to get to our first reader here in a moment, but I did want to mention, for those of you who might be curious, Dr. Bishop has written 2 books. One is How Zombies Conquered Popular Culture, The Multifarious Walking Dead in the 21st Century, and American Zombie Gothic. So you can find more info in those. We have them at the library, and we have at least American Zombie Gothic available as an ebook through the library. So if you look that up on your laptop, your phone, or whatever, you can access that as an ebook as well.
Very cool.
So yeah, thank you so much. And for our next part of the evening, I would like to introduce Professor Laura Walker, who is going to be our first reader and is going to read a spooky piece for us. So I won't spoil it and say any more, and I will hand it over to Professor Laura Walker.
All right, thank you. I'm actually going to be reading a few pieces. I tried something. Christopher, there's something behind you. You should maybe watch out for that. But I appreciate Kyle's presentation, just because the idea of the different conceptions of zombies, I think in an interesting way kind of ties into what I'm trying to do tonight, which is think about different ways of telling ghost stories, or even to put it even better, different ways of kind of narrating haunting. So fiction, it tends to be my primary genre, at least these days. And I'm working on a novel that has evolved quite a lot over the amount of time that I've been working on it. And I decided that for tonight's reading, instead of doing fiction, I wanted to try actually doing some haunted poetry. So it's looking at and thinking about the different ways that we're haunted. This was actually the original conception of my master's thesis. I wanted to write a collection of a whole bunch of stories, and that whole bunch of stories ended up just being one really, really long story. That's the novel that I'm currently working on. And so I'm kind of trying to get back to that idea of examining haunting, not just from the angle of ghosts, but the variety of fears and nightmares and other things that tend to haunt us. I considered also going into the political landscape that's a bit haunting right now, but ultimately ended up putting that aside for now. So I'm going to start with this poem that's called Beast, and this is a kind of anti-ode, and it's a piece about I guess being haunted by mental health. So, Beast, you hovering thing, pinprick black in a sky of azure. Oh, you broad-winged beast who retreats but never disappears, who spirals upward and away until I can ignore the wavery shade you cast, blending with my own blithe shadow. I can pretend you've left for good until I look up and forget I could ever forget. I close my eyes against you, creature of despondence and despair, for I know if I look, I'll see your form tracking lazy circles in my sky, the details as you come into focus, the sharpness of talon and beak, the outline of each feathered scale, and my own reflection in your empty eyes, reminding me again that this is how bad gets. All right. Ooh. And then this piece, I guess just harkens back to childhood and some of the, again, non-paranormal, if not actually normal fears that little kids can be confronted with. So this is called What We Found There. We were no Hansel and Gretel, my sister and I. We wandered a different sort of wood and found a different sort of house. We wanted ghosts, hauntings, mystery. We wanted our books come to life. What we found was darker still, a house that housed no children like us, no families like ours, only vagrant woodsmen eaten up and swallowed whole by regret, chasing out their own monsters, devils, demons, with bottles and magazines tipped over and spread open, glinting like cursed treasure through the windows of a house that meant to have us, meant to cage us and keep us, with the smell of fermented sweat and those pictures, glossy and raw, like nothing we knew existed, until we pushed our way inside, greedy little children, and the images ensnared our eyes, pushed against our throats, crawled inside us like dark things. Back in our own house, our room looked the same, wallpapered with drawings of monster rats and vampire bats, all red eyes and pointed teeth, fairy stories of a dark youth grown darker, but they were stories we no longer believed in, having wandered like we did into a different sort of story, with no breadcrumbs cast down in innocence to lead us back out. Okay, so this next piece, this is a pretty new and pretty raw one, still kind of in a current state of revision, but this is where I'm at with it right now. And this is a piece that came out of an experience I had about a year ago on campus, where I was really confronted in a kind of unexpected way with the loss of faith and loss of a sort of like spiritual home or a home of faith that's been kind of forced on me, I guess. And so this is a different kind of haunting, I guess. It's the sort of haunting of longing for and missing something that you might not ever be able to get back. So this one is called "This Dead Bird Is My Heart." The bird is yellow and black. Its head twists to the side. Its neck is clearly broken. And I am broken and broken and broken again. Faith does not behoove me. It is a room of lighted windows, alluring and impossible, against which I strike and fall. Get up, try again. This thing I do has become a sort of protecting of the abuser, a sort of making of excuses to cover up my own unmaking, my own systemic erasure, because this conversation about me is not where I belong. You tell me it is not where I belong. You are not where I belong. All right.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I have a couple more if that's okay.
Oh, actually, yeah, that's perfect. Yeah.
So this next piece is a translation. So my friend Carlos Bertoglio, he teaches Spanish in the Languages and Philosophy department, and he and I collaborated over the summer on a translation of one of his poetry collections. So the collection is called Conversos, and it's a series of poems that he wrote to his son, who's now 3. Gosh, might actually now be 4 now that I think about it. And this is one of the ones that I translated that I just felt like fit into this theme of haunting. So the poems are all numbered, and this is number 20. One day this house will be a heap of stones when time or war have separated us, and death like fire obscures our walls, our fever, our shared tongue. My name, a void on the edge of your lips, cruel spring, vile murmur, the mob, the landslide, the sorrow of knowing ourselves lost. In this world of limbs piled up on a table, you'll walk without me, and you'll be okay. It'll be natural. Perhaps one day, and by coincidence, you'll kick a stone, and it will be the last and lowest bit of foundation. Right then, and not a moment before, throw away the key, breathe deep, and follow your path. So I guess you could call that a kind of moving away from the haunting of past into hope of some future. Okay, I lied. I still have 2 more. So this next one, I wanted to play around with form a little bit and try some erasure poems, which I've never tried before. So these are poems where you take a text and you black out part of it, and with the words that are left, you kind of use those to create a new text with some kind of new meaning. And I actually took a page from my own manuscript and kind of just toyed with this form. So this is what it looks like. You can see all the black, and then the blank, what just looks like blank spaces are the words that were left behind. She dreams shadowy black details, a gift she has to navigate in full dark. This house makes her waft away in the sudden blaze of vision, fade into streaks that can't be. Her eyes follow the fear, its icy fingers like stains against a surface, dust and blood. She is home. So that was just a fun one that I wanted to try out. Okay, so this will be, thanks Christopher. This will be my last piece, and this is a brand new one. inspired by my walk home from work yesterday, where because of all of the wind, there were Dia de los Muertos bags, the bags that they had used to decorate Suma and Shakespeare, the Shakespeare Center, were kind of just blowing all over the place. So this is just inspired by that moment. And it's called Offering Time. It is autumn, los días de los muertos, the days leading up like stairs, and then back down to the threshold of winter, steps of stone carved into the side of a mountain we climb endlessly, endlessly seeking our dead, holding the candles of our own lives to light the way we slip through cracks into the grotto, push past stone's embrace, stuffing our ears with dried corn husks to block out the jack-o'-lantern howls that gather, shadows to our shadows, trailing behind us, before us a net of darkness to trip us up, to ensnare us in our own grief, the beating of our hearts in rhythm to the pulse of some slumbering beast kept alive and sedate by the fear we feed it, by our whispered breaths, hush, hush, as we move through the moonless dark, searching for faces and figures we know, senseless to all but the pull of our longing, our chasm-deep desire to have this one night, this one chance for that touch, changed and unchanged, that voice, husky and dry, the piercing of skin and bone, dreams and daylight, that pins part of us to this place of endless night and sends part home to wait out the year, all the seasons of the living. Okay, and that's it.
Oh, thank you so much, Laura. Those are really, really wonderful. Can I just ask you, because I when I was listening to you read, I was kind of struck by how well you dealt with kind of the theme of haunting and how much it seems to be resonating in a whole new way this year, right? Especially, and I also loved how you took poetry and you showed how we can and like the intimacy of it and like its reliance on kind of mood and atmosphere and just how well that ties in with you know, the idea of haunting or like maybe even horror more generally. So is it all right if I just ask like is there something about kind of poetry as a form that was drawing you and like this was the way like I could best express this theme?
I think I want to say yes, just because, as I've said before, poetry is sort of my own origin story as a writer is in a place of poetry. But honestly, a lot of it was just wanting to try the experiment. I've always been kind of fascinated by exactly what you said, the mood and the atmosphere that can be created in poetry. And I think it works in a different way than it does in fiction. And so I was compelled to kind of try that out. And then also, quite frankly, all of my narrative energy right now is going into my novel. And so I didn't want to dissipate it by trying to create something new. And I didn't want to read something that I already had written or read in front of other audiences. And so my goal was to come up with something new that could be sort of like supplemental to my novel and to the narrative writing that I'm doing, without kind of taking that sort of energy away from it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes perfect sense. And I also wanted to ask, just because I know that you recently had something published in a horror anthology. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that's actually, it's a piece of flash fiction that I wrote during my MFA, and it had just been it was in one of those constant cycles of revision, revising, sending out, revising, sending out. And yeah, and it ended up finding a home in an anthology called The Horror Is Us, which is a really, really cool collection. I haven't actually read all of the pieces yet because I'm going to be going to a reading later this week, and I want to hear them for the first time from the authors. But from what I have looked at of it, it's just cool, kind of like innovative stories where like the monsters are other people rather than being embodied as monsters, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I think that is, for those of you who have not seen Night of the Living Dead, I think that's going to tie in perfectly with, especially what Dr. Bishop was talking about with how the film ends, especially. And you are going to be doing a reading for that, and I will share the link on the library homepage if that's okay. So that way, if you are interested in hearing and some like cool writers read from this anthology, that will be an option.
Yeah, and actually I should mention, just because we are talking about Night of the Living Dead, and this is something that Dr. Bishop talked about in his presentation, there is going to be another writer reading who's separate from the anthology. I can't think of her name offhand, but she has a book out called Horror Noir that's about the history of Black actors in horror films. And so goes, like, it goes all the way back to Night of the Living Dead. That has actually recently been made into a documentary on Netflix as well. So she's going to be talking, I think, and reading from the book for Saturday's reading. So yeah, thanks for that plug for that, by the way.
Yeah, you're most welcome. I'm super excited about it, and yeah, and those are fabulous pieces. Thank you so much for sharing with us tonight.
Yeah, and thanks again to Carlos. I see that he's on here, so I really appreciated the project of that translation and just being able to share that one piece. So yeah, thanks so much.
You're so welcome. Thank you. And now that we've kind of like set the mood with some haunting pieces, our next item for the